Hey everyone, so today we're going to dig into a really interesting and kind of challenging perspective on how we think about social inequality. We'll be looking at the arguments from scholars like Barbara Foley and Adolph Reed Jr.
You know, when we talk about social justice, we spend a lot of time, and for good reason, on things like race and gender. But the big question these thinkers are asking is, what if we're missing the bigger picture? Is there a huge piece of the puzzle that we just aren't seeing?
Okay, so to get into this, first we really need to get our heads around a concept that's, well, absolutely central to how we talk about social justice today. And that concept is intersectionality.
So, what is intersectionality? At its heart, it's the idea that different kinds of oppression, think racism and sexism, don't just happen in isolation. They're not separate lanes. Instead, they pile on top of each other. They get all tangled up, and they can hit someone all at once. This creates a totally unique experience of discrimination that's more than just the sum of its parts.
The most famous way to think about this comes from the legal scholar who coined the term, Kimberlé Crenshaw. She came up with this idea looking at a real-world legal case. It involved black women who worked at General Motors. See, they were facing a type of discrimination that wasn't just racism or just sexism. It was something else, something specific to being both black and a woman. So Crenshaw came up with this brilliant metaphor. The crossroads. Imagine you're standing at an intersection. Traffic from one road, let's call it racism, can hit you. And traffic from the other road, sexism, can hit you. But for a black woman, she's standing right in the middle of that intersection, where she can get hit by both at the same time.
Okay, so that's the framework. Now, the critique we're digging into today doesn't say that experience isn't real. Not at all. What it does do is ask us to zoom out, to look beyond the crash at the intersection and ask some tougher questions.
This is where a scholar named Barbara Foley really pushes the conversation. She says, look, the crossroads metaphor is great for showing what happens, but it leaves some huge questions on the table. Like, who built these roads? Why were they designed this way? And maybe the biggest question of all, what's the actual ground that these roads are paved on?
And that right there gets us to the absolute heart of this critique. The argument goes like this. Intersectionality is a fantastic tool for describing the effects, the symptoms of oppression, but, and this is a big but, it doesn't really explain the root cause. It tells us how it feels to get hit by the traffic, but not why the traffic exists. And for these thinkers, the answer to why lies deep within our economic system.
So to really unpack those root causes, this critique forces us to make a really sharp distinction between two words we often use interchangeably, oppression and exploitation.
Let's really break this down. In this view, oppression is what you experience. It's the racism, the sexism, the day-to-day discrimination. But exploitation? That's seen as the singular, structural cause. It's not something you feel in the same way. It's the economic engine of capitalism itself, the system of extracting value from labor. So think of it this way. Oppression is the symptom, the pain you feel. Exploitation is the disease, the machine that's causing it. And this changes how we think about class, big time. In this framework, class isn't just another identity you add to the mix. It's not another road at the intersection next to race and gender. No, it's something fundamentally different. It's what's called a social relation of production. Basically, it's about your function in the economy. Do you own the capital, or do you work for a wage? It's not about who you are, it's about what the economic system does. And Barbara Foley herself says it best. She argues that it's precisely this distinction that lets us, get under the hood and really understand the material roots, the actual economic foundation of all these different kinds of oppression.
Okay, so this is all pretty theoretical, right? So how does it actually play out in the real world? Well, let's take this lens and apply it to a really big and often controversial policy, affirmative action.
Well, according to political scientist Adolph Reed Jr., the story of affirmative action is really one of a massive transformation. I mean, think about this. It first showed up in 1935, and it was about protecting union organizers. Then, in the 60s, it was about making sure federal contractors didn't discriminate. But the real turning point, the game changer, was in 1978. A Supreme Court case called Bakke completely shifted the legal justification. It wasn't about fixing inequality anymore. It was about achieving diversity.
And that one little shift in language, it's everything to this critique. The argument from Reed is that the whole point of the policy changed. It stopped being about challenging the fundamental unfairness of the system itself and instead became about simply diversifying the people who get to win within that same unequal system.
And here's a stat that really drives this home.
By 2018, 7% of Black Americans were earning over $150,000 a year. Now, what that number shows is a growing class divide within a racial group. It suggests that a small segment is gaining access to the top, while the vast majority are still facing the same economic pressures.
There's a term for this idea. Scholars Karen and Barbara Fields call it racecraft. It's this belief, right, that if we can just get a few people from a marginalized group into high-power positions, a CEO, a top politician, then the benefits will magically trickle down to everyone else in that group. But the critique here says that's just not how it works, because it does nothing to change the actual economic structure that creates the inequality in the first place.
So this all begs a pretty big question, doesn't it? Why? Why did our focus shift so much toward identity and representation while talking about class kind of fell by the wayside? Well, according to these scholars, this wasn't some accident. It was a direct result of very specific things happening in history.
They point to a whole bunch of things happening at once. You had this huge assault on unions that just crushed organized labor. At the same time, the workforce itself was breaking apart into gig work and insecure jobs. You also had the rise of really important new social movements that were focused on reforms that weren't necessarily about class. And on top of all that, in universities, there was a big academic push away from these kinds of class-based analyses.
So when you put all that history together, it leads Barbara Foley to a pretty stark conclusion. She basically argues that intersectionality, from this point of view, isn't so much a tool that explains our world, but rather an idea that reflects it. It's a mirror held up to our specific moment in time, a time where we've largely stopped talking about class.
And so, in the end, this whole critique really leaves us with one massive question to chew on. When we're fighting for a more equal society, what is the actual goal? Is it to diversify the winner's circle? To make sure more kinds of people get a seat at the top of the pyramid? Or is the goal to get rid of the pyramid and change the rules of the game completely?